Hello, I'm Ron White, and I'm going to do a demonstration of some integrations in and out of the Salesforce platform. There's a very long presentation that kind of precedes this, and this is going to be the abridged version, so don't worry about that. So Salesforce platform has many APIs that do many things. REST, SOAP, OData, some value in there, and even CTI. Here's where you may see some of those APIs being used. Again, Salesforce is a platform. It's kind of hard to wrap your brain around if you're used to only dealing with service or you're only used to dealing with sales. You can run your whole enterprise on Salesforce. But today we're going to focus mostly on the ETL, batch, and the middleware, our ESB, and a web service frontier in the top portion of the diagram. I would be remiss if I did not mention the file integrations capability. Salesforce has file sync, and if you're used to Box or you're used to Dropbox, you'll be used to file sync. It's a really cool product. It's mobile enabled and enterprise hardened. Salesforce Connect is a way that Salesforce can integrate third-party repositories. This is huge for organizations that have a lot of IP and SharePoint, or for organizations that are doing everything out of Google. The idea being that you can have those files synchronized or pulled in at the point of action within your Salesforce org. And Salesforce Connect, I'm going to spend a long time talking about this because once you wrap your brain around it, it's really, really cool. You know, it really turns the idea of ESB, so ETL, on its head, and I think that's a very, very good thing. So Salesforce stores data in what they call objects. They have the standard objects, account, contact, case, and then they have custom objects, and custom objects can be whatever you want. We've had clients that built their own HR system on the Salesforce platform, as a for instance. But Salesforce Connect gives us this third type of object, which is called an external object. The way I like to think about an external object is it's essentially a view via an API into any data source that you can imagine. Pretty powerful when you think about it. So typically there'd be projects, and I've been on a couple of these, where you'd kick off this large ETL project, you'd pull the data from some system, put it into an ODS, and then you'd have another piece of another ETL that would take it out of the ODS and put it in the Salesforce. Of course, you got to worry about changes, and you got to worry about latency. You got to worry about idempotence. You got to worry about lots of stuff. There's a lot of stuff to worry about in the data integration space, right? External objects kind of takes all of that away. There's 4 integration patterns that they follow. The first is connecting to OData APIs. OData is a format, a methodology. I think they say on their website it's a means to develop simple and secure REST APIs. Developed by SAP and Microsoft, a lot of the big ERPs have picked it up. And with some simple Apex, you can actually build your own adapters. And once you get into the frontier of building your own adapters, you can connect to anything that you want. And the code, a lot of it is actually kind of reusable. And you invest the time to develop out a couple adapters, that will be time well spent from a resource perspective, because you're going to get to reuse a lot of it. And then there's Salesforce Connector, kind of a niched use case, but for those in the niche, it's a lifesaver. Some of these big companies have multiple Salesforce orgs, and an org may be for a specific business unit, but sometimes those business units, even though at the point of creation, they thought, well, they're going to be separate, they got to be autonomous, they need to talk. Or in the case of mergers and acquisitions, or splits, having a large company like a PayPal split into PayPal and eBay, there's a lot of work that has to be done from an integration standpoint, and the idea of external objects is very helpful in those situations. And then you can also connect through middleware. Now, this is not the classic middleware use case. We're talking about middleware external object. So it's pretty cool. You could have a SnapLogic job or a MuleSoft job that actually goes out and hits maybe 3 or 4 different ERPs, does some diffing, does some quality checks, and then returns the data in a beautiful, pristine format. As long as that integration is configured properly, it's OData compliant. And what that means is that it can be instantiated via an external object. It's important to note that external objects are metadata about the endpoint, meaning that the data doesn't appear until it's instantiated. It's not actually stored in your Salesforce, so it doesn't actually count against your limits. You don't have to worry about whether it's current or not, because it's real time. And that concludes the presentation. And as promised, I'm going to spend a little time on OData right now. This is, for lack of a better term, an OData homepage. Goes through anything and everything you wanted to know about OData. But for the purpose of the demo, I'm going to jump right into the reference services. And I'm going to click on this trip pen service, which is an OData v4. And I get this. How is that useful? It's not very, but it is definition of a service. What am I going to do with it? Let me show you. All you have to do is copy the URL, and within your Salesforce, you first create an external data source, and I've already created this one, which is TripPin. And if you'll notice, that URL right here is the same URL as it was here. It's just the endpoint of the service. And how did I define this thing? It was really as simple as naming it, saying it was OData4, and pasting in the URL. All this other stuff was set to default. Doesn't get much easier than that. So once the data source is defined, at that point, then you can start to define the external objects. And the easiest way to do this, actually there's even an easier way. Is to click into the external data source and then click validate and sync. When you do that, it's going to actually pull all of the source objects based on the service URL. And that's it. Once you have them in your Salesforce, you can do anything you want with them, just like a proper object. And let me show you where that may make sense. So let's take a look at a contact. And let's take a look at the fields of the contact. Let's see what we got here. Astro location, trailhead fan. So let's say that it's important to define an airport that's associated with a contact. Why not? Very simple. New external lookup. It's going to be related to airports. And let's just go give it a 255 just for fun. We'll call it airport. And it's related to contacts. And for those of you who haven't seen this is how easy it is to create a field in Salesforce. And not only a field in this case, a field that references an external object with references an OData web service callout with absolutely no code. Pretty powerful stuff. We'll go ahead and save that. And now, let's give it time to save. If I go back to my contact record, good old Tim Barr here, I see there's a new field for airports. And if I was going to use this field, you'll see that it actually does a real-time call out to the OData source and pulls back a list of airport codes for me to use. Pretty cool stuff. So that's an example of how an external object can be used within the app, but the use cases really expands exponentially when you think about how it can be used outside the app. So I'm going to switch over to the Force.com IDE and really briefly about that. If you haven't experienced the IDE, it's probably worth getting a read on it. If you're an admin, you'll probably never have to touch this, but if you're a dev or you do a lot of integrations, it will probably become your friend. So I'm in my IDE, and this is an example of a web service callout that I built to SnapLogic at once upon a time. And this is the trigger that invokes that web service callout. Actually very, very powerful, but now in the world of external objects, it even gets a little bit easier, I think. But let's go ahead and open up the Salesforce schema really quick. And let's just see how this new external object behaves from an API perspective. So the external objects have the naming convention __x. We are looking at airports. Let's go ahead and query airports and see what we get. There we go. So now this is a this is an external object, it's a first class Salesforce object. It even has a relationship back to contact, which is pretty cool. But what that really means is now I can run SQL on it. Take a look at the syntax, very, very SQL-like. And now we're going to actually dive into the very specific use case, and that is a lead to cash use case. And it'll become apparent why I had to give the overview of the integrations as we kind of get into the weeds here. There's a lot of different ways you can go with this. First and foremost, this is the sequence diagram. This is what we're intending to do. A lead starts in Eloqua and it makes its money in Zora. And we're going to demo all these touch points from left to right. The middleware that we're going to use for this is Informatica Cloud. Now, I have been critical of Informatica Cloud in the past, but this release was actually really good for Informatica Cloud, and the reason why is because you could finally do real stuff. They got away from the 5-step wizard, and then you were able to do real transformation, and you didn't lose any of the stuff that made Informatica Cloud interesting in the first place, which was the idea of the Informatica Cloud marketplace and all the different connectors you can get. So for example, there's anything you can think of is featured here. I still prefer SnapLogic. Everything's said and done from a productivity standpoint, but I digress. This demonstration is going to be done with Informatica Cloud. So you can see they got an Alico connector and a 30-day trial, and I've actually loaded it up in the live Informatica Cloud instance, and that's how we're going to be connecting to Eloqua for the first hop of the sequence. And the last thing you need to know about this proof of concept or demo is it integrates with a customer master. Now, for the purpose of the demo, this is a customer master. It's an MDM solution that I built on a SQL server. And the point of it really is to illustrate that Informatica Cloud, whether it's behind your firewall, whether it's in the cloud, or whether it's even on my PC, it really doesn't matter that the tool is going to be capable of integrating to any endpoint. This is a very, very simple MDM system. If you cannot tell what's going on by looking at it, it's a simple three table schema that just has the type of party, the type of source system, and then it calculates the version and the locator ID based on the inputs. And the locator ID, a way to identify a record, multiple recurring instances of a record, different versions of a record. So with this Tom Tucker record, you can see the locator ID is the same for all of these, but there's only one with a version 0, and that happens to be the last one that was inserted. So systems that want to consume the master data would always just look for the record with a version of 0 based on the incoming external ID. So if that didn't make too much sense, don't worry. It should become clear as the demonstration progresses. So now we're going to run through the first couple sequences here, Eloqua to Salesforce, and then user interaction with Salesforce. So we'll start that by looking at Informatica Cloud. And now we're into the mappings here, and the design pattern that I use for this is not a terrible design pattern, but it's not one that I would typically use. The design pattern is one where it actually reads from Eloqua, spits it to a file, and then it reads from a file and puts it to Salesforce. And the reason why I did this is this Eloqua environment is a dev environment, and I've been assured that the data is dev, but it's still not my environment, and I just don't want the awesome responsibility of having that data associated with me in any way, shape, or form. So what I'll do is I'll show you how it writes the file, how it does so successfully, and then I'll pick up a dummy file just for illustration purposes on how it can actually get into Salesforce. So go ahead and take a look at this. We'll go into edit mode so you can just kind of see how it works. Very, very simple. I've defined my source as using the demo connection, and I pull the specific object, and I can preview the data here. And this is very, very useful for just sanity's sake. And you can see that there's plenty of data in here in Eloqua for me to use. And all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to write this data to a flat file. I'll go ahead and cancel out of this, and I'll show you the next job. Actually, we'll go ahead and run this one just so you can see that it works. And we'll come back to you. And the second stage of the hop is actually inserting in the Salesforce. This source is defined as a flat file source, and it's kind of neat. When you look at the fields here, I've pulled in only the bare minimum that needed to be pulled in. So by default, Informatica Cloud will pull in the full schema, but oftentimes you really don't need the full schema. So I find it's a good practice to get in there and basically pull only the stuff that you know you're going to need for certain. I've got some filter logic in here, and this is just for use case purposes. The idea is that you only want leads that are hot and that came from a campaign. And the expression transformation, if you're familiar with Informatica, this is near and dear to your heart. Very, very similar. The expression language and all of the different functions that you're used to being able to do within Informatica, you can also do within Informatica Cloud. And the functions in Informatica are very, very similar to Oracle. Sometimes they're missing a little, sometimes they add a little extra. Bottom line is, if you're good at Oracle development, you're going to be very good at developing expressions in Informatica or Informatica Cloud. But for the purposes of this demo, all I'm doing is inserting a source system code into Salesforce. So let's go back and take a look at that last job that we fired up. And you can see it inserted 798 records successfully from Eloqua to the flat file. And now we're going to go ahead and go back to the flat file to Salesforce mapping. One thing that's worth pointing out about this map is, again, on the topic of the Salesforce platform and the API, they have this functionality that's called an upsert, which is an update else insert, very common in relational database land. What that means is that within Salesforce, you can define an identifier as an external identifier, and Salesforce can use that to update. It's very appropriate in this situation where we might be running multiple batches from Eloqua to Salesforce. We don't want multiple leads inserted in the Salesforce. If there's an overlay in the batch cycles, or we have to do a reload or whatever, it's always safest to use an upsert in those scenarios. Let's go back to the monitor and verify that this job completed. Nothing on the monitor, so it looks like it successfully loaded one record to Salesforce. So let's go check it out in Salesforce. Still, I'm back at the Salesforce homepage, and I can see that a task was created to review the converted Eloqua lead. It's good to note that we showed Eloqua to Salesforce via Informatica Cloud and the API, but I would be remiss if I did not mention, in tune with the overview that I did earlier, is that there's just a ton of options for integration with Salesforce. And even Eloqua's own documentation has steps for integrating CRM and specifically for integrating Salesforce. So I wouldn't get too hung up on the design pattern. The point is that it's extremely easy to get data in and out of Salesforce. But how did this task get here? That is a good question. But before I get into that, let's go ahead and just check out the task a little bit here. So what does it say? It says review the converted lead, and it gives me the name. Let's go ahead and check out this lead. And everything looks good here. I'm going to go ahead and convert it. Now, I think in the real world, you would have some Apex that kind of looks at these fields and determines whether it should be converted or not. But it's not that uncommon, especially in smaller shops, for individuals to actually look at the lead and actually decide to convert it. So we're going to go ahead and convert Carter Pewterschmidt here. And you'll notice when we converted Mr. Pewterschmidt, he now became an account, and Pewterschmidt Industries became the account. Carter Pewterschmidt became the contact, and we've also created an opportunity for Mr. Pewterschmidt. So that's all good and well, but now I'm going to take off my regular user hat. I'm going to go back to my dev hat, and I'm going to answer the question, where did that task come from? So another really cool concept with Salesforce, and it does segue into integrations, and I'll show you that in a bit, is the idea of workflows and workflow rules. So the reason why that task showed up is because I built a workflow rule that said, anytime I get a lead with a source system of Eloqua, I want you to create a task for me to review that lead for conversion. So here's this role right here, very simple. Lead source equals Eloqua, assign a task to Ronald White. But if you may have noticed, there's other workflow rules that I have set up on here as well. And one of them is an outbound message to customer master for converted lead in Eloqua. So this is pretty interesting. So if if an account is created with a source system code of Eloqua, then I'm going to fire an outbound message. And the description is send Eloqua account to customer master. Let's take a peek at this. So this is sending, well, you can't see what it's sending here. Let me edit it. This is sending an ID and a system mod stab to this endpoint. And if you look, you can see this is an Informatica Cloud endpoint. So let's see what we can find out about that. So let's take a look at some of the task wizards here. And here we have the Salesforce SQL Server upsert. And you can see what we're doing here is we're taking the input from the account, which was the web service. We're looking up the contact data. We're looking up the party types and the source system values from the customer master SQL Server, and then we're inserting in to the SQL Server. And actually, let's go ahead and edit this so you can see the schedule tab. And this is where that endpoint is. This endpoint is the same endpoint that you see in the outbound message definition. So what's happening then is once that record is, once it meets the workflow criteria rules, once this criteria evaluates to true, once an account is created based on these rules, it's going to fire that Informatica Cloud integration. And here you can see that the job is now running. So the account has been updated and that outbound message has been fired, and now there's a job running. It's only one row because it's only applicable in the context of that very specific account. And it's completed. My one record from account, and it gave me a one record in the party table. And let's just go ahead and verify that that record showed up. And indeed it did. Carter Pewterschmidt, version 0. So important to note that that was an integration from a Salesforce Cloud via Informatica Cloud to a behind the firewall MDM solution that I'm calling Customer Master. Now the idea here for this kind of second half is more batch style. And the first step in that is to get the Customer Master data back to Salesforce. And what that'll do is it'll indicate on the account record that it's the account is ready to be provisioned. And there's a flow that will actually provision the user and then return provisioning data back to the account record. And then the last leg of this journey is the zero integration, which will be done at a later time. First up is we have to get our identifier back from the Customer Master to Salesforce. This is the record we're looking at, and we'll check that out in Informatica Cloud. And this is the mapping that's responsible to do, for doing that. Very simple. I've defined my source, and I've actually written a query here. And we do not necessarily want all versions of all records. We only care about version zeros. And furthermore, we don't care about the IDs necessarily, we want the names. So this is how this will look. It's basically pulling back proper version zeros of the records where my source system is Salesforce. And we'll go ahead and run this. And while that's running, we'll take a peek at the target. And this target is simply pulling the external ID, the customer master ID, and the party name. doing an update because we have the original ID from Salesforce in the incoming, and it's simply just mapping those identifiers to custom fields, customer master ID and customer master name, back to the account level. And we have a warning here. Looks like we actually got an error. Let's check that out. One is rejected. So it looks like, because this is a demo, of course, that one of the records that was set for update had actually previously been deleted. I know that this is not a concern because I deleted the record, but I'll probably keep this in the video because this is a good example of how to troubleshoot errors with Informatica Cloud. Informatica, in their defense, does have excellent logs. So Peter Schmidt should have been updated. Let's just double check that he was. We should see a customer master ID and a customer master name, and there they are. So the last part of this journey gets a little convoluted, so bear with me. We've exchanged information with the customer master, and now we need to provision the user. Now the provisioning system for this proof of concept is Pivotal. And what the developers have done is they've created a dummy service for this proof of concept. But the dummy service is just a REST GET. It does not allow me to post, and per the sequence, I need to post. So just to demonstrate a post, what I've done is I've used a JSON placeholder, which if you're not familiar with it, it's a great site for doing exactly what we're doing here. And I've used it in the past for users. It comes in very handy if you need some fake users with some addresses. But what I'm going to use it for today is to demonstrate the post. And I don't actually get to put data on their server, but what they've done is they've given me a fake post response, which is all I care about. If I post this information, they will reply with an identifier, and that's enough for a proof of concept perspective. And this is an overview of the REST post mapping. Very, very simple. It pulls a random record from Salesforce. It builds out a payload and it submits the payload to what I'm calling the user target, which is, again, my fake JSON placeholder post. And you can see after this post runs that there were 2 successful records from accounts, which corresponds to 2 successful posts. And just to verify, there were a post file and a success and error file created. And here you can see that there was a status of row created for both records. Again, the point of that was just to demonstrate the post. What I really want to now do is interact with Pivotal. And I'm using the same design pattern, mostly because it was easy for me to verify the data as I went along, where I'm reading from Pivotal, writing to a file, and then I'm actually reading from that file and writing to Salesforce. No surprises here. It hits the service and then writes a file. And then on the Salesforce side, it's picking up the file, which was the exact response from the service, and it's writing to account. And it's updating based on the Salesforce ID. It's returning the service ID from the Pivotal response, and it's also setting the flag to is provisioned, which, going back to the sequence diagram, the is provisioned is going to be the flag that starts the create subscription within Zora. So we'll go ahead and run this one, and you can see per the Informatica log that it has completed successfully, and we should be able to verify this in Salesforce. I am provisioned and I have a Pivotal service ID. So the remainder of this sequence diagram is actually going to be carried out by Zora. Zora has a very, very robust integration with Salesforce. There's absolutely no need to use middleware. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I will now conclude, and perhaps at a later date, I will add in the Zora piece.